Hello and welcome to the first lecture in a series on group and organisational communication. My name is Rajendra Shepherd and I'm very pleased to be your lecturer for this course. I'm going to be working alongside Greer Hospitalis, who is an experienced lecturer and business practitioner, and so I'm very pleased that we can bring our combined knowledge and expertise in this particular area. I want to say a couple of things about the style of presenting. I'm actually going to be speaking to slides rather than delivering a presentation to you in real time, and therefore I don't have the benefit of you as an audience, and will have to consider some of the questions you might be asking in order to fill in details. Secondly, I would ask you to bear with me as I pause and reflect on some of the content. The benefit of this, in my opinion, is that the information comes out in a layered way and it gives you a chance to build on the understanding as the details are cumulative. So today I've called this particular lecture Communicating because it reflects something that we're going to be looking at. It reflects the fact that we'll be looking at models of communication, and it also reflects the fact that this course is layered. It's layered in the sense that over the next 12 weeks we're going to be looking at theory and practice. It also is layered in the sense that we're going to be looking at the nature of communication in the contexts of groups and organisations, and it also is called Communicating because I want us to develop a certain understanding of a definition of communication that I think is particularly pertinent to this particular context, which is that meaning is ongoing and not static in the way that communication process is considered in other communication contexts. So today we're going to cover an overview of the course. We're going to look at some of the important definitions of what we mean by group, what are the qualities of organisation and organising that we're really focusing on, and how are we using communication to understand what is going on within this amalgamation of people. And then I also want to talk a little bit about why you're doing this course and what I hope you will get from it. As you'll see from the images, I've put different types of organisation on the slide because I don't want us to misconstrue that this is a course about business communication. It is actually a course that includes organisations and includes the notions of organising as they have happened through business and for business, but it also, I hope, will encourage us to look at different kinds of organisation. And I've put an image of a mosque, and there are other kinds of organisation that I want us to think about, all of those associated with law and order, policing, law courts, with education such as schools and universities, obviously the other kinds of religious organisation and the different levels that they work at in order to organise. We can also think about groupings in terms of the family unit, and that's probably one of the places that we go to when we first start to think about groups. But also there are groups within organisation that I think are important for us to look at. And also we can look at the home as an organising space for the family. So we can look at organisations in different ways and at different levels. And obviously in focusing on those different types of organising, we're actually going to be looking at the communication that both emerges out of those units, and also the communication that is said to constitute those units. So for the purposes of this course, we can talk about communication as having a constitutive function. And by that I mean there are researchers that consider communication as the primary cause or primary feature of organising. It is through the communication process that we actually end up with this organising quality of the particular groups of people. So let's move on to pinning down what we're actually looking at. So I want to read this quote for you from the Lumen Learning, which is a teaching group. We are going to be looking at the communication processes associated with a group of interrelated people in order to achieve a common aim. So we have three particular elements there: the process itself of communication, and as I said, we're going to be looking at that in terms of layers. Interrelated people, they're connected by their function, and that function is marked by a common goal, a common aim. And notice that when we're talking about communication and processes, we can talk about organisation, but I think more importantly we should be talking about organising for the purposes of this communication course, and I want you to keep that in the foreground. This means that we have to understand something about organising itself, because we're really looking at a process rather than the notions that we might have of business, which of course, as I have said, will feature in this course. So we're seeing a face mask, and I pose this question: how far do we need to look before we start seeing the tension or complexity in this ambition of looking at the communication of interrelated people to achieve this common aim? I suspect you will know, even from the fact that I've asked this question, that we're obviously dealing with people, and people are complicated, and then we have layers of complication with this idea of achieving a common aim. So clearly there are, varied pressures that shape how we've organised, and that's a good, starting point, a good place to start looking. So we're looking at what connects us, and even in terms of us thinking about joining an organisation itself, like a university, as we have become party to it, we end up doing more than just being static. We go through there are a number of features to us being part of the organisation. We feel that maybe as a university member, that we need to be productive. We also have the requirement or the pressure that we need to uphold its reputation in some way, because that reputation, that organisation comes to define us in part. There's personal ambition, personal goals that we achieve through the organisation, which is the body with the power and authority to say that we are qualified or not qualified. These are the things that have been created around this organisation. And lastly, this organisation locates us socially, because we pass through this organisation and we leave with something that we have sought to get from it. But we can also consider how the organisation has changed over time, how it's changed historically, and what has changed with respect to our social relationship with being organised. In other words, how has the whole concept of being organised changed over time? How do we feel about being organised, mobilised, affiliated, and connected? Before we go ahead and define what we mean by organisation and small group, we should acknowledge that we are on slippery ground in the sense that the definitions we are using are of utility to communication scholars. As the image on the left indicates, there is going to be a casual definition that someone might use, and there are going to be legal definitions and definitions from other spheres of life that have an impact on what we're really talking about. So in the image on the left, Antifa considers itself a conglomeration of people with a joint purpose. However, it is clearly unhappy with being listed and labelled by the American government as a terrorist organisation, and actually even contests the fact that it is an organisation because of how it considers itself. So this is an important point to start with. Why do we talk about organisation in FLUX? Well, I use that term because I want to highlight a number of different things. One is organisations are not static. They are not the buildings and the physical assets alone. And I say in FLUX as well because organising is an iterative process, as I see it. It's an ongoing process. It's something that is dynamic and changes with the processes that happen within and the processes that happen in the environment, thus applying pressure to what we're talking about in terms of the organisation. I say in FLUX as well because, as the article on the right indicates, in talking about targets for the National Health Service in the UK, people move. There are different requirements for what is contained within the organisation. The organisation's goals can change. In the business context, we can talk about organisation rebranding, and therefore when we think about organisations, I think we should think about organising and how it is ongoing and its purpose is changing as much as the actual content of it as it is seen at any one point in time. I've included this slide to highlight something else which is complicated about communication, and that is that we are exposed to multiple sources of information in this day and age. These 4 social distancing posters actually use different language, different imagery, and in actual fact, different facts. We have different distances of 1 metre, 2 metres, 1.5 metres, and is there actually value in the specifics of these distances? Well, health authorities would have us believe yes, and therefore we are being told to physically distance or social distance for very important reasons, if of course you believe the source of information. Now, I add that caveat because health providers and health institutions have been putting out information which in some cases has been conflated with political needs and political information. So we have multiple sources of information, and we have different sources of information that come from different components of society because they are seeking to have us do something different. So the police are going to talk about social distancing in a certain way that is different from healthcare providers. Institutions, organisations do try sometimes and mesh what they're saying, but often there's a messy overlap in what is being communicated. If you think back to when the information first broke about COVID-19 and the need to be socially distanced, it was confusing. It came from different government individuals, so that's one institution, but it came from different individuals, and it had a different mood to it according to whether it was from national security or whether it was from the chief medical officer or whether it was from a minister. I myself was actually looking at international news as well to see what the rules and regulations were in other parts of the world. And while there were parallels with what we were being told to do in Trinidad and Tobago, there were ways in which the rules were being presented in different ways. We can also look at these posters in terms of the mood, if you like. I think mood is probably a good word because it encapsulates the language and the imagery. I think there is a difference to be taken away from this command of keep your distance or even respect the distance from talking about social distancing and physical distancing. And then if you look at the middle two posters, the one with the yellow background is really suggesting that we socially distance or physically distance in order to keep safe in this general way, in the sense of safety is important to us as individuals. The third one is actually talking about the spread of the virus, and while it's a small difference perhaps in your conception, it is actually different. And I think as an accumulation of the information that we're getting from the posters, we end up taking away slightly different things, and that can have an impact. If you think about it, why we're being asked to socially distance across these posters is actually different in each of them. How to do it, in other words, what is the actual space that we're meant to keep from each other, for what reason is different, and how we react is different. The different moods of the posters impact how we feel about each other with respect to keeping this distance. How do you, for example, react when you see someone without a mask? Do you regard them as being selfish and maybe intolerant of the rules and of thinking about each other? Or do you regard them as standing up for their rights and their freedoms? Or do you think that maybe they have a valid point and they have reason to actually not be wearing a mask? Do you wonder if maybe they have health reasons for not wearing a mask and therefore are completely justified in not wearing it? And then there was this situation. I suspect fear is a highly motivating factor in the way we perceive information, in the way that we receive it and the way that we behave. And therefore, maybe for very valid and understandable reasons, we had panic buying when the COVID-19 rules were first mentioned, and we had this idea that groceries would be shut for certain periods. The reason I've included the image on the right to talk about this situation that's going on with littering in the UK is to say that there are ways in which, if rules aren't reinforced, if the communication happens once and we're not reminded of it, we can slip back into bad habits. We don't have to look too far to actually see ways in which some people, I guess, would be inclined to follow rules, and then there will be other people who are disinclined to follow them. But separate and apart from that, even those that are inclined to, kind of be rule followers, there are certain things that will slip out of habit if the ideas aren't constantly reinforced. And of course, in a communication sense from a government or an organisation or an institution, that all requires a certain amount of money and access to resources and expertise. So why are we here? What is the purpose of doing this course? And what will you get from it? Well, I actually think the idea of creating these units that we're calling small group and organisation is of personal value to us in terms of understanding the broader context of communication. But also for those of you who come to this course with an interest in management and business, there will be enough content coming from the corporate world and the business world to fulfill that particular learning ambition and hopefully provide you with skills that will be useful to you in the world of work. I've actually added a quote here from Catherine Miller at the bottom, which is that organisation has structure and it intersects with other organisations, meaning that organisations actually are in a network of other organisations. I suspect if you take an organisation that had nothing around it, an environment around it that didn't support it, it would actually fall apart. And we'll talk about that in tutorial a bit more. I do want to make a plug for the Catherine Miller text. I'm actually going to provide a link for you that actually makes it available, and it's actually a really good text. It is very business heavy, but it is the source of information that I think is really useful for the business component of this course. What value will you get from this course if you're not focused on the business element of things? Well, I suspect some of the value will be dependent for all of you on how you plot your way through the course. There is enough space, I hope, for us to be talking about things outside the world of business, other kinds of organising, and certainly there is going to be enough lecture content to highlight the ways in which organising happens in many different social contexts. But for the purposes of this slide, we should say that we're looking at how organising impacts communication and also how communication impacts organising, which is the constitutive part of this course. So what we're really saying is that communication has a reflexive relationship with organising. Some people talk about a reflective relationship, and for any of you that have done reflective writing, you'll know it's this process of internal self-inquiry. The idea of looking at where ideas come from, where thoughts and feelings come from, and contextualising them as having value to an impact later on. However, I am interested in us talking about the reflexive relationship because as students of communication, I think this idea of communication building, maintaining, negotiating and creating organisation is a really important perspective, and therefore I hope through this course we'll get to explore the different ways in which those features of communication come to have meaning and utility in the construction of organisation. So you can give me your best onion jokes in tutorial, but this is my way out of it. The reason I'm talking about onions is because I think it's a really good metaphor for the way communication features in this course. If communication is defined as making meaning, which as communication students is probably where we start, certainly when we talk about the kind of two-step models, the transactional models of communication, and we're going to talk about that today, then this making meaning, we can't talk about how it functions until we have a grasp of the structures created by organising. So we're going to have to look at those, and sometimes we're going to go deep and sometimes we're going to go shallow, meaning that from the outside of the onion looking at organising to the inside, we might find ourselves talking about specific communication under certain parameters, but also we're going to need to move through the layers to think about organising as a concept, the different types of organisation, and how in their structure communication is impacted. We're going to look at the particular roles occupied by people and how in those different roles communication becomes different, the function of communication becomes different, and the impact of it becomes different. And then of course we're going to look at some of the behaviours in language itself, some of that in tutorial and some of that in lecture. So as you will know, communication as a discipline heavily intersects with psychology, sociology, media, and for this course we'll also be looking at management and perhaps less obviously to you, facets of the human world experience and what the human world experience has to say about communication in terms of metaphors provided by biology, engineering and cultural studies. Hence, it's complicated. But here's the payoff. With this complication, there will be ways in which you will begin to see the world around you in new ways, I hope, and you will see how you're impacted by the processes of organising. So I hope it's an enjoyable experience and that we get to move through the content together. So here's our poor Will Smith image, and I only put him up because I think he looks fed up, and it's born out of his confusion as to how it could have happened that this deadline has changed. And again, I want to come back to this issue of communication. What is really meant by deadline? Because clearly for him something happened between finishing the assignment and submitting it. Things changed. So we've already said that communication is complex, as meaning itself is a range of things. We know that people have different meanings and of things that are stated, and even at another level we can see that different meanings come about because of some particular language issues. So we have terms like deadline, we have extended deadline. Deadline might be a submission window, therefore a time period, and it might be a fixed date. And then when we think about deadline and what it means, what are the penalties for not abiding by that deadline? What are the latitudes for extending it? So politics, for example, talks of deadline in different ways to maybe some other spheres of communication. Politics talks about red lines, and a deadline period can be a long period that is defined more by an action than by a specific kind of moment. So on the right hand side of the slide, I want to just highlight the fact that the course has theory and application, and as I said, in the first 6 weeks we're going to need to focus on some theory so that we get definitions out and we talk about organising in the new ways that we're going to need to think about it. And as I said, we have this kind of 6-week division of theory and application, which is broad and something we need to think about. But I'm also introducing strategic communication into the course as a particular assignment and as a way of delving into communication in practice, and I'm really interested to see what we come up with, because there is a research component to this strategic communication, and I think it will be a really valuable skill to take with you beyond the course. So at this point, let's do a quick recap of what we've said so far in terms of communication and the processes and organising. We've said that the message itself can have variable meanings, and I think when we talk about comprehension, we can talk about it in two ways. We can talk about the semantics, the different meanings, as we were saying, with respect to things like deadline, and the variable ways meaning is changed because of additional kind of context. But we can also have meaning issues around someone being able to comprehend a message. We have the complication of communication that comes about through multiple sources with differing facts, such as the posters about social distancing. So we use multiple sources of information, and therefore that can be part of the issue. And then within that, the language of the message can vary. We have differing beliefs about the validity of the information itself, and therefore that changes people in another way. It changes them because it can therefore have different impacts on the potential behaviour of the receiver of the communication. We also said that communication can be impacted by issues such as fear. In terms of organising, we have a number of complications there too. We have that language can be constitutive of organising. So we can have terms like hospital and understand what that means of the particular place or church or kind of health centre or police outpost. Any term that is applied to something bestows a organisation with a certain kind of function and a certain set of qualities, and therefore protocols emerge and protocols are developed, so the communication of those protocols impacts the organising. We have organisation and organising as a contested term, and therefore with legal ramifications. And then we have organisation as being a site where there are targets, and therefore there is no static place that we can kind of latch onto in terms of that organisation. There is no static entity. It consists of many people, and their roles are changing and the targets are changing, and in some ways the function can change, because that's not static either necessarily. Okay, so let's move on and talk about what we mean by small group. I've alluded to it already, and as I said, small group is 3 or more, so more than the dyad, more than the pair. Another feature is this idea of a common purpose, and as we've already said, that can be difficult to pin down. Mutual influence, meaning that the members each have an impact on the other, and therefore because they're considered part of a connected entity, they have a shared identity. They have a shared sense of what it means to be part of that unit. But there is no set number of how many people are part of something that can still be considered a small group. So 3 is the minimum, but the upper range actually depends on the purpose of the group. But according to the source that I've cited there, Communication in the Real World, that anything beyond 15 to 20 members, so that's also given as a range, but anything beyond that means it becomes difficult to consider them a small group based on the various kind of definitional points that we've already mentioned. So we can also think about the small group in terms of internal and external influences that impact the group structure. So internal factors, member characteristics, play a role in the group information. How well informed about the group's task or how highly motivated are group members as they formulate and as they coalesce in terms of leadership, in terms of following, and how does this impact the processes, the communication processes that are internal in terms of decision making. As you know from your own kind of coalescing in small groups, in friendships, in units within school, in student groups, members gravitate towards different roles, and within roles people can become advocates, they can push certain kinds of action, have certain kinds of agenda, and you can already start to see how communication becomes impacted by the idea of this structure. You will have experienced it already in many different ways, including and beyond the kind of family unit, which is perhaps the one of the most kind of commonly spoken about small group units when we start to talk about what brings people together. There are external influences that we can talk about, such as the size of the group, what their task is or tasks are, and the resources that they have access to. So you can get small groups within organisations. You can think about departments. In the hospital environment, you can think about nurses and doctors and physios and admin staff, clerical staff, management staff, all working together to ensure the functioning of a department or a unit. Now, some groups will have more control than others over the external factors, and therefore within groups sometimes there will be greater decision-making capacity. And I've actually put up this image on the right of two sample structures, and these are just two of many possibilities, but you can already see the differences in them. The one on the right shows Tara in the middle as the group leader, so she is central in some way. She is maybe like a manager or somebody in the middle of a unit. And then on the left of those two sample structures, you kind of see the cyclical model in which there's back and forth between each member, and I suppose that kind of structure might apply to, say, a small group where everyone has an equal vote and information is passed around a kind of chain. And so we can see that groups actually develop certain kinds of hierarchical structures by the way they're actually connected. And as I've already said, the small group can be part of an organisational hierarchy, and so there's power within power, and you can get this kind of feeling already of networks of groups that are actually part of a larger organisational structure. Just to give them their names, the circular group structure is called a circle, and the other is called a wheel, and the wheel has a centralised person, a gatekeeper, an authority figure, and maybe that is the kind of structure you see in a family where, while there is mutual influence between children and parents, the parents have a controlling role and are kind of central in the decision making. So let's look at a couple more slides that help us define small group. So we spoke about the identity already, the shared identity, or we mentioned it, but the degree to which members share the in-group identity varies from person to person and within different kinds of groups. So within the family unit, we have this idea that some people are more reluctant members perhaps than others in doing certain things. They get less excited about certain kinds of things. I've put up two other images, one of a group of friends, and are they equal friends to each other, or are two of them kind of stronger than the third person? How does this affect the cohesion? And maybe you can imagine across circumstances, or across time rather, where there are circumstances where people fall out and they don't remain connected in the same way. So the in-group idea, the idea of how part of that group you are when there's maybe an alliance that's formed between two people within that group, that can change. The family we have touched on, and then on the left the team, the basketball team maybe. They're all part of an identity, they all share an identity, they're all part of a group, and they're connected by this particular goal of trying to win this particular match. But when they take those shirts off, they are group members of other types of group, maybe, families say, and therefore, they are said to be part of, intersecting groups, because those families aren't actually connected to each other beyond these individual members in this particular team, say. So why do we form groups? We can think about the different reasons that groups tend to form, and we've already hinted at them in different ways. There are instrumental needs of survival, protection, shared access to resources, and in some ways we can think about the way the family functions. Children aren't self-sufficient, they're not going to be able to manage on their own, and therefore clearly have the needs of a parent for basic survival and protection. And there are other kinds of survival needs that happen outside the family that bring people together, that cause them to connect to each other. There are interpersonal needs, this idea of friends, friendship. It creates a sense of belonging, and within that group we want influence, and we perhaps want decision-making influence. We want to be able to change the direction of the group, the trajectory of it, and what resources it uses, and what it does. Remember, on the flip side, there are people who, let's say they want to be controlled, or they're happy not to have a controlling stake. I think we are all sometimes this way, where we just need someone to give us some direction, but there are also people who perhaps in a particular given circumstance feel that they don't function well, and therefore they need a leader to follow. So within a group we can talk about shared responsibility. Within that interpersonal relationship, we can think about different kinds of responsibility, say in therapy, someone who suffered abuse, someone who's seeking emotional support. In those kinds of circumstances, people join a group because they want someone to help them with direction, not necessarily tell them what to do, but help support them in some way. So there's another way in which we can think about why groups why groups are created, why groups come together, and that is group identity. Affiliations are a building block for identity, and our social identity, our social comparison, our connection with others is important to us. I think it's why social media thrives. We find ways in which we connect to people, we have shared interests, we have shared values or cultures or missions, and sometimes belonging to particular groups, maybe following particular influencers on social media, we seek prestige by dint of being connected to it. It helps improve our own view of ourselves. It gives us a reputation as maybe doing the right thing if we follow an advocacy group or a charity, and it also has a function to improve our self-esteem. It makes us feel better about what we're doing because it's connected in some way to purpose and what we construct as important to us. So I'm going to put a link in the material about something that small business has to say about the importance of group and group communication in terms of creating a kind of coherence within the goals of business, but also we can talk about small group as being shaped and being defined in some way by the task that it needs to achieve and the relationships that are built up and oriented by the formation of that small group. So let's move on and talk about organisation and what defines it. Catherine Miller has this list of 5 critical features, and I suspect many people would have this same group. Other researchers might have something a bit larger, but we can be sure that these are 5 central features. And the reason, of course, that we need to define it, not only because we need to be clear what we're talking about, but because, as came up earlier, the nature of an organisation, the nature of it being an organisation is actually contested. And so we can talk about whether these features are present as to whether something is technically organising and an organisation. So we have this idea of social collectivity, meaning that within society there is a commonality of purpose, perhaps, commonality of identity. There are various features that would socially locate an organisation. We can be clear that an organisation has an overarching goal or overarching goals, and within that, individual members will have particular goals. So we can again talk about the hospital environment and the way in which, as an organisation, its overall approach is to health and perhaps wellness, but certainly health. And within the organisation, there are going to be different departments that do different things, obviously. So there are departmental goals, and within the departments there are individuals that have particular goals that are meant to align with the organisation, but also, as we've heard from our discussion around group, there are kind of personal goals as well within that are important and definitional of how an organisation is constructed and functions. In order for a grouping to be considered an organisation, it also needs a coordinating activity. There has to be some mechanism by which members are actually governed and driven in their particular agenda. So communication, of course, is one of those coordinating activities, but as we keep referring to this idea of constitution and the constitutive qualities of communication, we can also talk about the way communication actually becomes defining of organisation in and of itself. So it creates the idea of the organisation. We talk about organisational structure as the 4th point, meaning that an organisation, of course, has individuals, it has processes, it has policies, it has rules, many of which may be codified and therefore are set out and written down as particular parts of the structure, separate, of course, from any kind of physical structure or virtual structure that may exist. And lastly, we talk about an organisation being defined as organisation on the basis that it is embedded in an environment of other organisations. So a school with this role of teaching obviously is in a network of other schools, and its relationship to other schools means that each of those organisations has a function in defining the value of each organisation. So if something exists in an environment where there is no other organisation, to what degree can it be maintained? What is it that then defines the standards that are sought after? What is it that defines the function that it has? I think in the absence of other organisations, we can see how a grouping would quickly fall apart and therefore wouldn't be sustainable. So just to talk about the structure in terms of the wheel and the cycle that we mentioned with small group, we need to talk about hierarchy in organisation, and I think we're probably very clear about the many different ways in which power can exist in an organisation. Laterally, from top to bottom, in different kind of connected units, in groups within organisation, across across departments, etc., etc. So we can talk as well about the complications that come about through collective and communal relationships. So these are the power centres within particular organisations. Many times we can see ways in which power overlaps because there are networks of small groups within an organisation, and people kind of straddle multiple functions within an organisation. And lastly, we should talk about the fact that organisation can change across time and space. And I think globalisation is a good way of thinking about what we mean when we talk about changes across time and space. So the impact of globalisation, or things like democratising information through the use of social media, impacts the way an organisation actually works. You can maybe relate some of this to the struggles that Facebook has been having in terms of defining itself as a news organisation, as a publisher. It's just one of many social media platforms where people become connected, and over time the value of the organisation in terms of its material value to society and in terms of relationship and its structuring role, I don't mean its financial value. In terms of those things, we can see that over time the organisation actually shifts and has to kind of change in order to evolve with the times. So let's move on now to talk about the communication models that are relevant in talking about group and organisational communication. So the idea of communication models is going to be familiar to you, and we can talk about the transmission model of the communication process, meaning that we have this metaphor of the archer who sends a message is sent, and therefore communication has happened. And this is common in places where instructions are given, directives are given. It's just it's a unidirectional model of communication, and it has its function in defining communication in emergency type situations, for example. And there are different kinds of transmission model. We can talk about the transactional models, and those have a metaphor of a dancing pair, and you can see the ways in which the dancers are interacting with each other and responding to each other, And we automatically have built into this idea of transaction the notion of feedback. And of course, in this way, the individuals are actually interacting with each other and are responsive to each other. Lastly, we have the constitutive models, or the models of constitution, that we have introduced in talking about group and organisation. And we're going to get into these in a particular lecture in this course, but at this point I think it's important to acknowledge the ways in which communication is seen as a key feature of the creation of organisation. Some researchers actually say it is actually the primary feature of organising. I'm going to have us work on an exercise in tutorial that I think will help bring to the fore this idea of constitution and what we're really talking about when we talk about a particular process or a particular protocol or a particular approach to communication having a constitutive function in organisation. One of the key names associated with the constitutive model is Robert Craig, and I've taken these quotes from him about the model itself from Catherine Miller. He says that the transmission model and constitutive model provide useful contrasts. As I said earlier, the transmission model uses this metaphor of the archer firing an arrow, and in the sending of a message, communication is said to have happened. And so that is a model that can be applied quite usefully to command type situations, emergency situations, where the information is given. It's the communication process that is associated with putting up a poster, for example. The message is sent and therefore communication is deemed to have happened. The constitutive model is one in which through each communication act the meaning constitutes the body of the sender, and therefore we can say that the constitutive model of communication as applied to, say, the police is in each communication act an act of maintaining law and order through whatever communication mechanisms we're talking about. We get a reaffirming renegotiation of the rights and responsibilities and the function of policing, for example, and we can apply that to all kinds of institutions and organisations. He also says that the constitutive model can be thought of as a meta-model. Now, a meta-model is a model of models, and what that really means is that the idea of constitution or construction of the world out of communication provides an umbrella for other models, meaning that the transmission, once it happens, it actually constitutes and in and of itself has a constitutive function by recreating the nature of the components within transmission and of the transmitting body. So when a public health announcement is made over the tannoy in a grocery, there's a constitution happening of shoppers and how they should behave in a particular space. I was in a grocery recently, and they were announcing about wearing masks and keeping a social distance. In that particular event, the grocery itself was reminding each shopper that it had a responsibility for the welfare of shoppers, or maybe it was trying to control shoppers. We trust the information that's coming over the tannoy. The belief is that it is from a place of authority, maybe a place of seeking our welfare or seeking our interest, and therefore we respond to it. And that is what is meant by this idea of constitution. And there are different ways in which this can happen, And so we're going to be looking at those through this course. Robert Craig has also given us a list of 7 domains where communication theory can be seen to have seem to be a way of explaining what is going on within organisation. And these are listed here: rhetorical, semiotic, phenomenological, cybernetic, socio-psychological, socio-cultural and critical. Now some of those we will have come across in other courses, and others may be new to us, but we may have come across them also in other types of courses. So the rhetorical analysis that looks at the way individuals interact and considers notions of power, discourse studies, that kind of thing, can be applied to notions of agency and the controlling states of bosses against workers, or the role of managers and supervisors and those kinds of things. And in a rhetorical analysis, you might be analysing dialogue, you might be analysing discourse, you might be analysing kind of interactions and texts of interaction between individuals. Semiotic analysis looks at identity and corporate symbolism, so things like branding and logos and typography and the other kinds of things that are used to construct a brand. And we're going to be looking at that today in our tutorial. Phenomenological looks at the phenomena of conflict, and so we can talk about mediation as a area in which we can apply communication theory to understand what is actually happening in terms of relationships between people. Cybernetic theories deal with information processing, and the cybernetic theories really deal with the way information is used, the way automation has happened, things like algorithms and processes like feedback are part of cybernetic theory. Socio-psychological, we can think about the ways in which employees go through personality tests and therefore are communicating ways about the way they fit into society in a way, they kind of function and think. Socio-cultural theory, as the 2 parts of the term indicate, can be applied to this idea of multiculturalism, multinationalism, the different ways in which culture impacts communication and social situations impact communication. And then critical communication theories look at being advocates and changing particular positions of thought, and therefore can be applied to things like equality and issues around gender, LGBT, for example. One of the things that I wanted to say about the theories and the different areas of theories is around this issue of power. Power is something that I think probably threads through organisation at all kinds of levels, and it can be a particular feature of the communication process that we look to analyse to understand organisation. And the reason it's important is because we can talk about and think about access to resources, for example. We can talk about the way power is enacted through the commands, the way power is enacted through processes or certain kinds of control that people have over others. We can look at power at all kinds of different levels, and I think it's a really useful lens through which to consider communication in the space of organisation. Now, just for the purposes of today's lecture, I would like to take a moment to look at what we'll be doing in tutorial. So I've put these questions up for you to use as prompts for a video that you will watch in tutorial. The video is a short illustration and animation by someone called Matthew Koschmann, and he is talking about organisational communication, and it's just another way for us to look at the information about the way communication can constitute organisation, in contrast to the way we think about organisation as being a container out of which communication can happen, and organisation being a container in the sense that it is completely contained and holds all of the kind of assets of an organisation. But the reason I've put up these questions is because I just wanted to have us consider them for a moment. So one of the questions you'll be applying to this video is about hierarchy, and I've asked, how does hierarchy impact the way you communicate within parts of the UE? But what I mean by that is also how hierarchy imposes the way you communicate within parts of the university. What is it about the way the university is structured and maybe the administrative function is structured that creates the channels through which you communicate and the ways in which you communicate? I want us to explore it because I think the university setting and the university as an organisation is a really good place and familiar place for us to start with when we want to think about these questions. I also want us to answer this question about internal communication. So for anyone who's worked in an organisation where they've had an internal communication function, you will know that someone within the organisation, maybe marketing, maybe it's a separate communications unit, has a mechanism by which they contact staff and indicate all of the things going on within the company, or the things that the company wishes to happen and for employees to be aware of. So what we're going to think about are, what are the features, what are the behaviours and the patterns that are indicative of internal communication, and what are the functions, what's it actually serving to do when a memo comes around to all staff indicating that it's going to be a fun day or a new policy, or there is a staff newsletter or a staff website indicating a particular promotion, for example. And thirdly, I asked this question, or I've made it as a statement rather, that people communicate for many more reasons than sharing information. So we know this already, that when communication happens, particularly in organisation or in small groups and units, that there are social functions, there are social things that are happening in tandem with the content of information being generated. And so I want us to explore, what are the ways in which our roles are reaffirmed, what are the ways in which our relationships are impacted by the communication process. This is the video you're going to watch. I think it's better that we do it in tutorial only because it's going to take up some time, and I think that's probably the better place to do this. Also in tutorial, we're going to be looking at the semiotics of brand logos and slogans. Take, for example, this Nike logo with the swoosh and the words "Just Do It." We're going to be considering about how the slogan actually works in the message that it conveys, and also think about maybe what the typography does and the symbols do in actually creating the brand, and also embodying it in ways beyond the actual logo itself, because we're starting to think about what it's motivating individuals who follow the company and who buy into the company to actually do and be part of. We're actually going to focus on how these elements of communication actually function to serve that particular purpose. One of the ways in which we can usefully interrogate slogans and usefully interrogate messages is often by taking the communication and reframing it, reworking it, and using those as comparisons to see whether the intention and the perception of meaning is actually the same. So what does it mean to take "Just Do It" and remove the full stop? In fact, the slide that I showed previously had "Just Do It" with the full stop. Interestingly, or perhaps not, the "Just Do It" slogan in the tutorial pack actually doesn't have a full stop. But does it make any difference? Does it mean anything to you? And I don't necessarily mean in the conscious way of reading it and deliberating it, but if you see something with a full stop, does that physical endpoint actually give you some kind of closure? What does it mean when you actually see a poem or see a phrase on a billboard, see a statement that has an ellipsis, for example? Do you, and has our culture acculturated us in such a way that when we actually see the ellipses, we actually think about something continuing or being part of an ongoing process? What does it mean to your perception if you add a question mark, or if you change the statement to one of inquiry, or if you change it to one of motivation? One could argue to tell someone "do it" is equal to "just do it," and yet there's something a bit abrupt about "do it" as a statement, which almost feels commanding in a way that to add the "just" softens it and makes it feel more like a possibility. So that's something we're going to be exploring in tutorial. Now, although we've spent some time talking about communication models and how they are relevant and particular to group and organisational communication, the idea of the constitutive model being a useful one when talking about the construction and maintenance of organisation, and the transmission and transactional models being useful when talking about communication that happens within organisation and from organisation, we haven't yet pinned down an actual definition for communication itself. And I would like to do that now by looking at the work of Betke van Ruler. She's a strategy theorist and someone who works within the field of strategic communication, and we will be coming back to her work later in the course for our particular assignment on strategic communication. But she offers this definition of communication being an ongoing process of meaning construction. So Van Ruler, in talking about the ongoing meaning creation and ongoing meaning processes, describes communication as being omnidirectional diachronic. So what does this mean? Omnidirectional refers to all directions. This is a concept that says meaning is not fixed, and not only is it not fixed, but it changes with time. So I just want to explore a little bit what we mean by that. So the fact that meaning is interactive means that it's actually a conspiracy, if you like, of the sender and receiver, and there is a participation, meaning that the receiver also has a hand in shaping the message that the sender is sending, even in terms of their construction. This means that the sender is thinking and constructing a particular message for the particular audience, understanding that the audience is going to have a specific or particular meaning, rather. So it's more than a two-way process, because audiences are stratified, audiences are varied, and particularly in terms of this concept of organising and the need to communicate from the point of view of an organisation, we understand that there are multiple audiences that we're dealing with, and even within that audiences there are variations. So this issue of diachronic now, meaning that meaning changes over time, can be thought of in a number of ways. If you liken communication to the process of a counsellor and a patient being in an interaction, there are ways in which meaning changes over time. As the conversation deepens, and let's say you were the patient and you were looking back at what was said, you would understand at a particular point in time what something meant to you, and looking back at it historically, you will understand it to mean something different from this point in time now. There's another way in which diachronic can be considered, and that is communication theory seeks to explain what something means and how the meaning process works. Over time, theory evolves, and therefore we have new conceptions for how meaning is made, and so we can look back in time and maybe make projections forward in time of how meanings are going to shift because of the way communication theory allows us to project onto the process the idea that the fundamentals of meaning are actually going to shift. And so here we are towards the end of this first lecture, and I want to spend a moment or two talking about the assignments that make up the 100% coursework. There is an essay which is going to be based on the first 6 weeks essentially, in that it's going to be looking at the theory and what you understand about what the theory says about organising, and we will be talking about that more in tutorial. The second assignment is actually a query portfolio. It's 3 pieces of writing that are opinion pieces, and these opinion pieces are actually going to be looking at the analysis of particular organisations using theory and what that analysis shows about organising. So these are going to be shorter pieces, and the 3 of them together will make up your portfolio. The last 2 assignments are actually linked and are based on the practice part of the course, so the second 6 weeks of the course. And what you're actually going to get to do is develop a strategic communication plan, and in a way do some research in order to model and test how that communication plan might work. So you can really think of it almost as a pilot study for the kind of analysis that you would do and maybe hand to a company or hand to a boss if you were coming up with a strategic communication plan. So I think it's going to be a really useful and interesting and functional exercise. Within it, you are going to come up with the plan. You are then going to create the communication texts and actually try those out on a group, on an audience, using a particular research technique, whether it be through questionnaire or through focus group or structured interview. And you'll do that in a small way, maybe using a very small sample, in order to generate some data to see how people perceive those texts and perceive the impact of them, whether there is any initiation of behaviour change, for example. And we're going to delve into all of this in a lot more detail, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the ways in which you actually use research to engage in the topic of communication as it pertains to organisation, and the kinds of problems that you would ultimately, as a communication person, potentially be helping an organisation overcome. So this has been a lot of information. I hope it's been interesting for you. It's certainly been interesting for me putting it together for this particular course, and I'm looking forward to seeing you throughout the course, engaging with the material. A word about the citations that are to follow. I've really listed them in order of importance for you, potentially, if you're looking for extra material to read. Many thanks.